Well, hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here with all of you today to talk about this important topic. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I joined Gift of Life, as Talia said, a long time ago in 2003, and I manage a team of social workers and counselors who provide grief and bereavement support for the families of our donors. My team and I also act as the liaison between the families of the donors and the recipients of the gifts. So if you've ever written to your donor family, or if you've ever received a letter from the family of your donor, it was my team who reviewed those letters and sent them to the appropriate person. I should say that is for donors in the Gift of Life region and transplant centers as well. If you are calling in from another part of the country, there is a team like me working at the organ procurement organization where you live who are doing similar tasks. While my main focus is supporting donor families, I do have many opportunities to talk with recipients. Many will call in with questions related to writing to their donor's family, but often our conversation will turn to how they are doing both physically and emotionally. You know, when faced with needing a transplant, so much is really spent and focused on physical health and the changes that one might experience. And sometimes the emotional aspect of transplant takes a backseat. So today we're going to discuss how there are so many emotions related to the transplant process. Some may be obvious and others less so. Some are positive and some are more complicated. Where do these complicated feelings come from? So we're going to talk about some of the losses associated with the transplant process. And when there is loss, there can be grief. So I'm going to give you a basic overview of grief and how it might manifest itself. And then finally, we will talk about how to cope with those feelings of loss. As Talia said, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A. Talia is going to kind of keep tabs on that, and she'll let me know if there's a question I need to address kind of in the middle of the slide. And then, of course, we will review all of them at the end of the presentation. So, okay. Let's get started. As I just mentioned, there are so many emotions associated with transplant. So we are going to start by taking a poll. Talia is going to initiate a poll. You're going to see something pop up on your screen. I want you to answer this question. What emotions have you experienced throughout the transplant process? You can choose multiple, so choose as many as apply. So answer them, and if you choose other, you can put that in the chat and then hit submit or save. I'm not sure what the button is, and then we will review them. So give everyone a little time to choose some of those emotions.
Hi, Lara. So I'll just keep an eye. It looks like it's like going up. So when it looks like it's kind of slows down, I'll stop it and share it. But it looks like people keep answering, which is great.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So yeah, so choose one, all, other.
Yeah.
Any combination that you see there.
Yeah. Oh, someone, not, oh, so I guess someone had selected other, and in the chat, they put shame, which.
Shame, okay, great.
Yeah, I guess we should have recognized that. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to give it 10 more seconds. So if anyone wants to do it, you have 10 seconds.
Last chance to get your emotions tallied.
Yeah. Oh, and someone also mentioned in the chat, calm and peace.
Calm and peace, okay.
And overwhelmed. Oh, we missed quite a few.
Yeah. Well, and certainly this poll didn't include every emotion.
Yes.
We just kind of came up with some of the top ones that came to mind when Talia and I talked about this.
Yeah.
Great. So, okay. So everyone can see the results. So we had a lot of happiness and gratitude, which is expected, of course, relief, sadness, worry, very common, guilt, anger, and other. And we did hear what some of those others were. Great. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. You can close the poll results. And like as we realized, this poll did not include every possible emotion. But perhaps there were some listed that may have surprised you, or things that people shared in the chat maybe were things that you hadn't thought of as emotions, but maybe you experienced them yourself. Emotions that I most commonly hear expressed when I speak to recipients is gratitude, relief, joy, excitement about this new stage. But there are others I hear that could be seen as maybe less positive. Guilt, survivor's guilt, as that was covered a few weeks ago by my colleague Jackie. If you missed it, I believe there's a recording available. You can watch that. Scared, anxious. People express a sadness for the family of the donor, and also sad for the things that the recipient and their family have lost. So let's talk about some of the losses you may experience as a result of waiting for a transplant and even once you've been transplanted. So we're going to do another poll. Talia is going to put up another poll for us. Please select all that apply again. And now we're asking you to think about what losses have you experienced throughout the transplant process. Again, these are not all inclusive. So if you think of something that's not there, you can select other and put it in the chat. So what are some losses you experienced throughout the transplant process?
I also wanted to mention, while people are doing this, the survivor's guilt recording will be included in the follow-up email that you get following this webinar today as well.
Wonderful. Great.
So we'll give this like another 30 seconds
Absolutely.
or so.
Yep. This one's might be hard to think about. Might be hard to think about it in this way. Again, as I said, often when we think about transplant, we're just so focused on our physical health and getting that transplant and getting better that we often don't pay attention to some of the other the losses that we may have experienced or we don't expect to experience. So this may be a little bit more challenging to think about, which is why we're having this webinar.
Oh, and people are commenting, I'm really sorry that they're only able to select one on this, and I'm really sorry about that. So it makes sense as to why there aren't as many. But if you are interested, you can certainly share additional ones in the chat. I think it would be really meaningful because I'm sure that many of you are experiencing many of these.
Yes. Got it. Okay. So the setup of the poll was not working.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay. We're going to talk about these different losses. So, but if anyone has any that are not up here, loss of normalcy, future plans, I see. Loss of self-identity. Great. Okay. So the loss of life is a big one. Financial stability, dependence, relationship changes, job, physical, norms, regular schedule, future hopes and plans, and those others. Great. So, okay. So let's kind of get into it. Potential future plans. You know, what you had imagined you might be doing. This transplant has obviously changed your health. And if you're healing well and you're doing well, you may expect to be able to have gone back to doing everything you were doing before. And that may not be the case. There are things that you had to adapt to because of maybe a complicated regimen or your recovery. Or while waiting, you have to put some plans on hold. There's the financial stability, the costs related to transplant that aren't covered by your insurance. When you're sick and out of work, and maybe your caregiver had to stop working. So there's concerns for your financial stability, your independence, needing help with activities of daily living, maybe not being able to drive, having problems with your memory, not being able to make decisions. I think about one volunteer of ours who he shares his story before he got his liver transplant. You know, he really, when he was in the very end stage of his liver disease, it really impacted his brain. And he talked about how he couldn't even do simple math, couldn't compute the tip of a restaurant bill. Whereas before, you know, he was doing kind of high level finance and math in his job. And the huge change between what he was able to do before and what he couldn't do now, and how much that really was difficult for him, a real loss in what he was able to do. Our relationships, there are so many changes in relationships whether it's with our immediate caregiver or extended family, how our roles change when one person needs to be taken care of and maybe isn't able to do the things they used to be able to do. Think about, the partnership between a spouse or a life partner, or between a parent and a child. If the child is now caring for the parent who is sick, just those changes in the dynamics can be a type of loss. Also, as your life becomes more focused on the transplant, you may have other relationships that fall to the side, maybe friends or coworkers who you just don't have the time or energy to engage with, or they may not really fully understand how your life has started to focus on something else right now. So those relationships have kind of fizzled away. So there's a loss there too. Your job, not being able to work while you're waiting, or not returning to work even after transplant. So much of our identity can be wrapped up in our jobs. And so when we aren't able to go back to work, or unable to work for a period of time, that can really be a loss for us. Our physical selves, there can be so many physical changes related to transplant while we're waiting, and then post-transplant. There can be weight loss or weight gain, changes in our skin tone, how the scar or incision looks, how your body has changed. Norms and routines. So all of us have experienced in the last year due to COVID, but for transplant patients, many of these changes that the world experienced are ones that you will have to keep up for the long term, right? Changes in where you eat, right? No buffets. I can't actually believe I ever ate at a buffet ever before. Giving up certain hobbies like gardening, high level of attention to staying healthy, this kind of super focused attention on that. Washing hands, not coming into contact with people who may be ill. And then our own mortality. The concern with our own mortality and potential loss of life. Needing a transplant makes it very clear that life is precious and not guaranteed. And there are many hurdles to health after transplant as well. And so the loss of the feeling of being invincible, again, is another loss that we may experience throughout the transplant process. And when we have loss, no matter whether it be because of a death or because of the kinds of non-death losses we just shared, it can lead to grief. So let me share this basic description about grief. It is normal. It is a normal response to loss. It is not bad or wrong or pathological. It is natural and normal. It is healthy. Reacting to a loss rather than avoiding it, denying it, pushing it aside, that reacting to it is the healthy response. Grief is also dynamic. It is not one response. There are many different ways to grieve over time. It's universal. All of us grieve, no matter our age, our gender, our faith, or our culture. Everyone grieves. Yet it is also individual. While we all will grieve, each of us will grieve in a different way. There is no one way to grieve. One thing that I often tell donor families I work with is that the good thing about grief is that we all do it differently, so no one can tell you you're doing it wrong. But the bad thing about grief is that we all do it differently, so you can't look to the person next to you to know if you're doing it right. Another thing to consider when talking about loss and grief is to consider that there are two kinds of losses. There is the primary loss, which is the loss that creates the grief response. Most people think of death as the only primary loss, but there are non-death losses as well. We just reviewed the many non-death losses related to transplant, but other examples could include divorce or job loss or moving. And in this last year, the entire world experienced losses due to COVID. Even if you didn't lose anyone, even if you didn't have anyone you love die because of COVID, you experienced losses due to all the changes that we were required to keep that help keep ourselves and our community safe. Secondary losses are what the loss means to the individual. And of course, this can be different for everyone. Not every transplant patient will experience the same kind of secondary losses. So let's think of this in terms of transplant. So if the primary loss is health problems due to end-stage kidney disease, right? That's the primary loss. Then the secondary losses might be giving up your favorite foods because of the disease, or limiting your fluid intake, not being able to see family far away because of your need for dialysis, the loss of your routine because you had to work around either going to a dialysis center or doing home dialysis, financial security due to not being able to work the same number of hours. So those are the secondary losses related to the first loss, which is loss of your health due to end-stage kidney disease. So what does grief look like? Many of us think of grief in purely emotional terms, but there are other kinds of grief reactions. I've gathered these in 4 categories: physical, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual. Physical is, and some of these may be hard to differentiate between a grief reaction versus also some of the changes in your body based on your health and the medications you're on. So some of the physical grief reactions, though, could be seen as like muscular. So maybe muscle aches and pains and tension, changes in appetite, problems sleeping, problems falling asleep, or you can fall asleep, but you have problems staying asleep. Emotional, that's often what people think about when they think of grief reactions. Anxiety, sadness, anger. There's others, there's denial, there's shock. Then there's the cognitive grief reactions. So when we're grieving, we are usually using a lot of energy on that grief, and that can really impact how our brain is able to focus and concentrate and remember things. So there can be cognitive grief reactions that we experience as well.
Lara, I do just want to mention really quickly, someone had asked that in the chat, so I bring it up now, in that they were wondering if like your emotions can impact memory.
Yeah, I mean, it's all wrapped up together. Sure. So if we're really emotional, then we're going to be utilizing energy to cope with those emotions, and our brain is focused on those emotions. May also impact how we're thinking and remembering things and comprehending and being able to concentrate. It's all very connected. And then the 4th category I have here is spiritual. So it's very common for individuals to, question their faith. Why is this happening? How could this happen to me? Maybe feeling abandoned. It's also common to embrace faith and maybe feeling closer to your faith than perhaps you had been feeling even before your health crisis. So one of the emotional grief reactions listed was anger. And I'd like to spend a bit more time on anger because I think as a culture, we are much more comfortable expressing anger than other emotions. And often anger is really a signal emotion. There is another emotion underlying that anger, but it's the anger that we express. So please, just for a second or two, I'd like you to think of the last time you were angry. Maybe it was this morning, maybe it was last week, maybe it was related to your transplant, or maybe it had nothing to do with transplant. But I'd like you to think back. So think back, reflect on a time when you were angry, and then complete the following sentence. I was feeling angry because I was feeling what? Please write in the chat what you were feeling. So I was feeling angry because I was feeling what? What were people feeling? What was going on there? Sad. Someone wrote sad. Frustrated. Alone. Helpless. Frustrated. Another frustrated. Out of control. Isolated. Out of control. Yeah. See a lot of frustrated. Insignificant. Yeah. Exhausted. Absolutely. Feeling less than. Guilty. Not understood. Abandoned. Bad decision making. loss of independence, so many great things here. I'm really sorry. My dog is trying to get into this room. If you hear the scratching, I apologize. He might answer this question. I was feeling angry because I was feeling lonely. Undervalued, pushed aside by family, vulnerable. Yes. Vulnerable is a great one. You know, I think it is so much easier for us to say I'm angry than to say I feel vulnerable, stupid, frustrated. Thank you, everybody, for sharing those. And so I put together a list. There were many, many emotions that can be associated with anger. A lot of them were here. A lot of them on my list, I've heard people say, you know, disrespected, ignored, threatened, embarrassed, abandoned, overwhelmed. I saw a lot of overwhelmed and frustrated. Hungry, that's a big one. I'll admit that. I definitely can experience the hangry, neglected, helpless, and hopeless. So all kind of things that are maybe under the surface. And as I said, it can be much easier to say I'm angry or act angry or do something that expresses our anger than to say I'm scared or I'm feeling misunderstood. It can be really hard to be vulnerable. And so I really also want to thank everyone for being so open and willing to share. All right, so now that we've discussed how we may experience some lows along with some highs, that's the roller coaster metaphor for you. How do we cope with these low feelings and experiences? So first, it's important to acknowledge that these are real losses and your grief is real. Although challenging, it's important to sit with and embrace these feelings. Your transplant journey is filled with many associated losses and grief. Know that your reactions are normal and okay. When others don't acknowledge grief and loss, we can experience something called disenfranchised grief. This adds a layer of loss to our experience because we aren't given the support we need or deserve. And so you also don't want to do that to yourself either, right? You don't want to say that this isn't real. Secondly, recognize that there are things you can control about your transplant journey, and there are things you can't. It can be helpful to make a list of those things, especially if you're a visual learner. What are some things you can control? You can set up a schedule to take your medications. You create a daily reminder schedule, on your phone or on your watch. You can use a medicine box organizer. You can't control the need to take the medications, but you can empower yourself to be in control of how you take them and building your day so that you stay on track with them. Setting goals for yourself. Start with something small, right? You want to set yourself up to succeed. So maybe it's saying, I'm going to take a walk around the block, but then you move it up to increase to a number of laps. Or maybe you haven't seen family for a long time because of your dialysis schedule. And then COVID, of course. Set a goal to see someone you haven't seen for a while, as long as your health and safety aren't jeopardized, of course. Having something to look forward to can help ease some of these complicated feelings. And sometimes we have to let things go. There are long-term changes that you are going to need to incorporate in your life due to your health. Ruminating on what should have been isn't something that will be helpful for you in the long term. It's not saying pretend it didn't happen or don't allow yourself to experience the disappointment and the loss. So it's recognizing the loss, allow yourself to feel whatever you feel related to that, whether it's disappointment or sadness or anger or anything, but then give yourself permission to move on from that so you can be open to the good and positive things in your life. Give yourself permission to take up whatever emotional space you need at this time. If you have the capacity, share the gift of compassion with others. Maybe there were many people who from your community who supported you and your family during your transplant journey. Find the space to be grateful for that outpouring of support, and then think of ways to pay it back. Maybe it's something you can do in your own community, or maybe it's something you would do for another patient or family who's also going through the transplant process. it feels good to help others. So finding a way to help that will be meaningful for you, while also refueling your energy is a wonderful way of coping. You don't want to overextend yourself and do anything that might deplete you. So it has to be something that will also refill that energy so that you can kind of keep going every day. It's important to commit to a routine of healthy habits, to establish a sense of normalcy and to take care of this new gift. Once transplanted, you are the steward of this gift, and your job is to take care of it the best you can. Meditation and relaxation have become household terms. There are many free apps that you can use to try different practices. I've included 3 here that you can try: Calm, Insight Timer, and Headspace. They all have different types. There are ones with music, there's ones with guided, there's one that's a minute or 5 minutes or 20 minutes. Some are male voices, female voices, voices with accents, voices without. Find what works for you. Just try them and see what works. It can be wonderfully relaxing. And of course, if you're feeling overwhelmed by these feelings, or you're just not sure what to do, ask for help. You have wonderful resources with your transplant team, and the social workers here at the Family House are another wonderful resource. Even though grief in response to loss is normal, it doesn't mean that sometimes a little help isn't needed. And these professionals may be able to connect you with other patients and families who really understand what you're going through. Peer support can be really critical as well. So I thank you all for your attention as we just kind of touched the surface on the emotional roller coaster. I would love to hear any comments or questions. If you want to put anything in the Q&A, I'm ready to try to answer.
Hi, I'm back.
Hi.
So I did want to reiterate what Lara said also, and also explain part of the reason we decided to do this webinar today is that we hear a lot from transplant patients and caregivers how major transplant impacts their lives, like the experiences and the lifestyle changes can be extremely overwhelming. And a lot of times they are losses that we're just not recognizing, like Lara had suggested. So I did want to mention 2 things that Lara said about, talking to others and helping others. We have quite a few support groups available, and I think they both can serve the purpose of sharing your experiences to help you feel validated and less isolated, as well as helping others who hear your stories. So it kind of offers both sides to it. So I would encourage you, if you wanted to be more vocal about these experiences, please join our support groups. So there, I see you're typing in response, but I think the other thing you mentioned is expressing gratitude, and what a wonderful way to express gratitude, or one way, in writing your donor family. So do you want to just briefly share a little bit about that and how it can be helpful for transplant families, and then you can even address his question or her question. I'm not sure.
So I think gratitude is a very common emotion, and people really can struggle with how to express that gratitude. And so communicating that gratitude to a donor family is not easy at all. And there are some of us who are better with words than others. So sometimes I tell folks that it doesn't have to be a long letter. And sometimes looking at a blank screen or a blank piece of paper can feel really overwhelming. So one of my recommendations is to go to, your local, card store, drugstore, and grocery store, and look at some of the cards, these thinking of you cards, or even thank you cards. They have really beautiful sentiment that may help you capture a bit of what you're feeling without having to come up with the words yourself. And also think about that this letter doesn't have to be the only letter that you ever write. It's just maybe your first one. And if the family writes back, there may feel like a more natural kind of, you have something to respond to. But I do think letter writing is a wonderful tool. It's letter writing is a therapeutic tool for many reasons. And I think there is something very special about sitting down and trying to express your gratitude. I think it really does help us as humans try to come to terms with the enormity of the gift that we have. So I think it's a wonderful tool to help us with that gratitude, to help us become really the best stewards of the gift. So I encourage everyone to write, not with the intent that you're going to hear back, but with the intent that it is really important to express, excuse me, that gratitude. For those of you who are in the Gift of Life region, you can send your letters through us. For those of you who live outside of the Gift of Life region, I would encourage you to send it to your transplant center, excuse me, and they will get it to the appropriate donor program to get it to the family. A lot of people ask, I think I saw one pop up, if you write and you don't hear back, can you write again? You can. I would give families a little bit of time to respond. There can be a delay in how quickly they get the letter, and then of course, how quickly they respond. But if it's been a while, if it's been 6 months or a year and you haven't heard and you want to write again to share with them maybe something that you've experienced in the last 6 months to a year, that is absolutely fine.
Thank you. So someone else asked in the Q&A, like, how would you best identify grief? I don't want to say symptoms, but like.
Yeah, I think, it's going to look different for everybody else. But if you've experienced some of these losses, then chances are you may be experiencing a type of grief related to those losses. And it doesn't mean it's going to be debilitating or you're going to not be able to get out of bed or you're going to be crying, but to recognize that you have these losses and that they would impact you in some way. Maybe some of those categories that I provided, those 4 categories, might help you identify, oh, you know what, maybe all that, all those, sleeping problems I was having, maybe that's related to the losses I'm experiencing or things like that. I am so sorry about my dog. He wants to get in here so badly.
Brian mentioned in the chat, your poor puppy.
I know, he's like, I don't even want to know what my door is going to look like when I'm done.
He said, Tim said, I'm grieving for your dog.
Yeah. I feel terrible. Oh, great.
So there was another question and now, so someone had asked, and this is more for the participants who are on the call, and then I want to turn it back to you, Lara, but someone had asked if people who are on the call now could share in the chat, if you've had your transplant, how many years post are you? Mm-hmm. Because I know, like I saw Jim Gleason's on the call, he's like 20-ish years or so post. So we have lots of variability of when people receive their transplants. But with that, Lara, could you just talk really quickly about, is there an expectation for some of these feelings? Oh, 27 years. Oh my goodness. Sorry, Jim. Is there like an expectation for these feelings to go away ever? And some of you also in the participants can share your experience.
Yeah, I would love to hear what, some of the long-term recipients would say about this. Certainly from the perspective of the donor families I work with, there's always an element of their grief. It never goes away totally. It just becomes less acute and less difficult. I actually saw a very interesting article recently that described, most people think that, grief is like a ball, that over time the ball gets smaller. This theory was saying that, the ball doesn't get smaller. It's just that our life builds around it. So we have more other things, experiences, good experiences that kind of counterbalance the loss. So it may be that, some of these losses are permanent, but our ability to kind of adjust and figure out what this new normal looks like while living with these losses, so that the feelings of grief may not be as acute.
Yeah, and I want to follow that with, you know, we're going to experience other losses at times after I mean, we talk about COVID, like how that's impacted things.
Yes.
Like for a transplant patient, you might have been sort of adjusting to your new normal, and then COVID comes and you have to readjust totally. So it's never like a straight line.
Yeah, no, it's never a straight line. Right. And some of these losses, to your point, some of these losses may be experienced, you know, before transplant, and then some may be experienced right after transplant, or then maybe not until a little bit later. So they may come at different times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So another person asked about writing again, and a little bit different. It's been a few years since the transplant, but they're still having some issues physically. And how do you write a letter when you maybe feel like you're not your perfect self after transplant?
So I would still encourage you to write. You know, you don't have to necessarily share about your health struggles, but if you are able to express whatever gratitude you're able to feel for that second chance, if you're struggling a little bit because things haven't worked out the way you wanted them to, you can still simply offer condolences on the death of the donor. And keep it at that, without having to go into maybe feeling effusively gracious if you're really struggling with maybe this was not all I thought it was going to be, because I'm still struggling physically. Simply acknowledging the death and offering condolences is a good way to go.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then about writing again, which I think is wonderful to be able to have this conversation now, since I think we did a webinar on writing last year.
I think so.
Yeah. So we do have that recording on our website, and the donor program, donors1.org, has lots of resources on writing to your donor family. Yes. So please check that out.
The website is actually donors1.org/writing.
Oh, perfect. That's
writing. donors1.org/writing.
Let me write that in.
And even if you're not from our region, it's most of the rules are applied, so you can follow those guidelines. Donors.
Yeah.
Thanks, Talia.
Yeah, and it's the resources and information is really great. So definitely check it out. So I think that should be clickable now or not. I don't know. Someone had asked or had suggested, like they had wrote 2 letters, hadn't heard at all. Should they write a third? They feel guilty. Like, how would you answer sort of that question?
Yeah, I would say, again, give it time. If it's been like 6 months to a year between your letters, then I think you can continue to write. You know, just because they haven't written back doesn't mean they don't enjoy hearing how you're doing. And should, for whatever reason, the family, maybe they've moved and they can't get the letter to them, you know, we do let the recipients know if we can't get a letter to them. I mean, I can think of maybe twice in my, how long have I been here? 18 years, where I had a family that said, you know, we just really, it's too painful for us to get letters. Please don't send them to us anymore. So I think more often it's just emotionally, they're just not able to write back, but they still really appreciate hearing